Have you ever seen a photograph that seemed to hold an entire century's worth of sorrow and hope? In the faded image, a little girl smiles as she eats an ice cream cone, but just behind her, a sign reads, "Whites Only." Her joy and that cruel reminder of segregation share the same frame, frozen forever in time. Decades later, that girl Rose would grow into a woman who refused to accept the boundaries history had drawn for her. A teacher, a dreamer, and eventually an activist who risked everything to demand equality. Her story, hidden for years in old photographs and forgotten petitions, would one day resurface, not as a footnote, but as a mirror reflecting the soul of a divided America. Tonight we'll follow the trail of that photograph from a dusty street in 1910 to a quiet museum hall decades later, where strangers stand before it, unable to look away. Because sometimes a single picture doesn't just capture a moment, it captures a truth that refuses to die. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March 2024. Dr. Marcus Webb, a quiet man who had spent 15 years restoring historical photographs at the Library of Congress, was sorting through a box of donations from an estate sale in Richmond, Virginia. Inside, he found a small photograph, faded curled at the edges and soft with age. It measured barely 4 by 6 inches, a simple sepia snapshot from another century. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. A young black girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, stood on a wooden sidewalk beneath the heavy heat of a 1910 summer afternoon. She wore a plain white dress with a little bow at her collar. Her hair was neatly tied, her expression pure and radiant as she held a cone of melting vanilla ice cream. Behind her, a storefront blurred into shadow, a tilted wooden sign hanging above its words, "Lost to Time." Marcus placed the photograph beneath his magnifying lamp. The paper stock, the exposure, even the soft depth of field, all perfectly matched the early Kodak Brownie snapshots of the era. Everything about it spoke of innocence, of quiet summer moment, long gone. And yet, something tugged at him. The sign, that faint, half-visible sign behind the girl. What did it say? The letters were too worn to read, swallowed by decades of dust and grain. Marcus made a note to run it through the lab's new high-resolution scanner, an instrument capable of revealing details no human eye had seen in over 100 years. He slipped the photo gently into its protective sleeve and logged it for restoration. He couldn't have known that this small, unassuming picture would soon unravel a hidden thread, one that led not only to the story of a single girl, but to a forgotten wound in America's past. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall lab windows, painting long shadows across Marcus's desk. He tried to move on to another photo, a Civil War tintype, but his thoughts kept circling back to the little girl with the ice cream. Her smile lingered in his mind. There was joy in it, yes, but something else too. Something he couldn't name. He decided he would scan the image first thing in the morning. Something told him this photograph was waiting to be seen again. 3 days later, when Marcus returned, the digital scan was ready. The archival scanner had done its work beautifully, capturing every grain and fiber at 12,000 dots per inch. He zoomed in on the girl's face. Her smile seemed even brighter now, timeless, untouched by the weight of history. But when he adjusted the focus toward the background, the blurred storefront began to take shape. Slowly, painfully, the faded letters emerged from the shadows. Marcus froze. His breath caught in his throat. The sign read, "Colored entrance. Rear only," and beneath it, smaller but still perfectly clear, "Whites only. No exceptions." He leaned back, chest tightening. The name of the store appeared just above the doorway, Dalton's Sweet Shop. Through the glass, he could see white families seated comfortably inside, beneath soft light and polished counters. The little girl, however, was standing outside her ice cream, likely handed to her through a back window or side door. That smile. Was it simple happiness? Or something deeper defiance, perhaps, though she was far too young to know what defiance meant. Marcus sat in silence. The room seemed heavier now. This was no longer a charming relic of summer. It was a witness. A fragment of truth from a time when injustice was written into wood and paint and accepted as ordinary. He saved the image, his hands trembling slightly. He needed to know more. Who was this girl who took the photograph and why? And what had become of her? He looked again at the red brick buildings in the background. Small town Virginia, perhaps. It was as good a place as any to start digging. The style of the awning, the width of the street, the old wooden sidewalk, each small detail whispered clues to Marcus. This wasn't a city scene. No, this was a rural town, the kind of quiet southern community where the air itself seemed to hum with memory. He began, as all true historians do, with the photograph itself. No date, no inscription, no photographer's mark on the back. Just silence, the kind that time leaves behind. But the donation records offered a faint trail. The image had come from the estate of Eleanor Hartwell, a 93-year-old woman who had passed away in Richmond only 6 months earlier. Marcus reached out to the estate attorney who connected him with Eleanor's granddaughter Jennifer. Over the phone, Jennifer's voice carried both warmth and a hint of nostalgia as she explained that her grandmother had been an avid collector of Virginia history photographs, letters, postcards, countless fragments of other people's lives. Most of them weren't family photos, Jennifer said softly. She'd buy them at flea markets, estate sales. She always told me every picture has a story worth saving. Marcus hesitated, then described the image in careful detail. The little black girl, the melting ice cream, the faded storefront. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Jennifer finally spoke again. Actually, yes, I remember that one. I asked her about it once. I said the girl looked so happy and that it was such a sweet picture. But my grandmother, she got very quiet. She said it was important to remember how things really were. Then she just put the photo away like it was something fragile, something precious. A shiver ran through Marcus. Eleanor had known something she had chosen to keep, to protect for nearly a century. He thanked Jennifer and turned his focus back to the photograph. The name above the shop, Dalton's Sweet Shop, and the architectural details behind the girl became his compass points. For 2 days, Marcus combed through historical directories, census records, and digitized newspapers. Finally, he found it. Dalton's Sweet Shop, 127 Main Street, Farmville, Virginia. The business had opened in 1907 and operated until 1923, owned by Herbert Dalton, who had died in a farming accident. After his death, the shop closed. The building itself was demolished decades later during an urban renewal project in the 1950s. Now Marcus had a place. The next step was the girl. He printed the enhanced photograph, packed his notes, and set out for Farmville on a crisp April morning. The picture rested inside his briefcase, safe but heavy, with its unspoken story. Farmville lay about 60 miles west of Richmond, a small town of just over 8,000 people. As Marcus drove down Main Street, he tried to imagine in it as it must have been in 1910, the roads unpaved, horses clattering over stone, the invisible lines of segregation running through every doorway, every sidewalk, every glance. His first stop was the Farmville Prince Edward Historical Society, housed inside a restored Victorian mansion at the edge of town. The building glowed a gentle yellow beneath the morning sun, framed by massive oak trees whose branches reached like old hands into the sky. Marcus parked, walked the brick path to the door, and took a deep breath. Inside, he was greeted by Dr. Patricia Coleman, the society's director, a woman in her 60s with streaks of silver in her hair, gathered neatly in a bun, and eyes that seemed to see everything. Her office walls were lined with books on Virginia history and old photographs of Farmville long ago. As Marcus explained his research and displayed the enhanced image on his laptop, her expression changed. Curiosity faded into recognition, then sorrow, and finally something darker. Dalton's sweet shop, Patricia murmured, leaning closer. I've heard stories about that place. My grandparents used to talk about it. She paused, her eyes fixed on the photograph. It was known for having some of the strictest segregation rules in town. Black customers weren't even allowed near the front door. They had to go around the alley, knock on the back, and wait. Sometimes, they waited for hours. And when they were finally served, they were charged more than the white families. Patricia pointed at the girl in the picture, her finger hovering just above the screen. Look where she's standing. On the public sidewalk, far from the entrance. She's holding that ice cream like it's the most precious thing in the world. Do you know why? Marcus shook his head slowly, though the truth was already forming in his mind. Because in 1910, a black child with ice cream from a white-owned shop, that was almost unheard of. Ice cream was a luxury. Most black families in Farmville worked as laborers, sharecroppers, or domestic help. They couldn't afford such things. But even more than that, many white shopkeepers refused to serve black customers at all. They didn't want black money. Patricia rose and crossed the room. From a locked cabinet, she pulled a large leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked with age, its pages thick and yellowed. She placed it gently on her desk and looked back at Marcus. There's something she said softly, almost to herself. Something you might want to see. The book was old, older than memory itself. Its cover cracked and dry, its pages fragile and yellowed like pressed autumn leaves. These are records from the Farmville Negro School, Patricia said softly, her fingers moving across the paper with the care of someone touching something sacred. The school ran from 1882 until 1953. If this girl lived here and if she was of school age in 1910, her name might be somewhere in these pages. She explained how the school had been forced to keep meticulous records, proof to the state that they were operating properly, though their funding had always been a mere fraction of what the white schools received. Side by side, Marcus and Patricia turned the pages slowly. The handwriting was ornate and fading each line a small story. A name, an age, a parent, an address. They looked for girls between 7 and 9 years old. The list was heartbreakingly short. So many black children of that time had never been allowed to sit in a classroom at all. They worked instead in tobacco fields, in kitchens, in other people's homes, their childhoods traded for survival. Here Patricia whispered at last, her finger stopping halfway down a page. Rose, age 8. Parents Samuel and Clara. Address Coleman Street, Farmville. She looked up, eyes bright with cautious hope. Coleman Street was part of the black neighborhood about 6 blocks from Main, near where Dalton's used to be. Most of those homes were torn down in the 1960s during the so-called urban renewal projects. They destroyed half the community. Marcus felt a spark of excitement tempered by the careful discipline of a historian. But how do we know it's her, the girl in the photograph? Patricia gave a small knowing smile. We can't. Not yet. But look at this. From another folder she produced a fragile newspaper clipping, its edges browned with time. The headline read, "Local Photographer Documents, Town Life." It was from the Farmville Herald, dated July 15th, 1910. The article spoke of an amateur photographer named Thomas Whitfield, who had spent that summer wandering through town, capturing the character and spirit of our fair citizens. Whitfield was white, Patricia explained, wealthy by Farmville standards. But what's remarkable is that he was known to have progressive views, and according to oral histories, he photographed black residents simply living their lives, not as servants, not as props in someone else's world, but as people. She paused her gaze, lingering on the image of the smiling girl on Marcus's laptop. Most photos from that era either erased us or reduced us to stereotypes. Whitfield was different. He saw the quiet truth. Marcus looked again at the photograph, seeing it now with new eyes. If Whitfield had been the one behind the lens, perhaps this image wasn't a token of cruelty, but an act of witness, a small, deliberate rebellion against the blindness of his own time. That night, back in his hotel room, Marcus couldn't sleep. The soft hum of the air conditioner filled the silence as he opened his laptop and logged into the genealogical archives. He began with the 1910 U.S. Census, Farmville, Prince Edward County, Virginia. He entered the names Rose, daughter of Samuel and Clara. A few moments later, the record appeared. Rose Black. Female age 8. Parents Samuel 34 laborer. Clara 32. Siblings James age 6 and Sarah age 2. They rented their home on Coleman Street. The census takers' neat, detached handwriting noted that neither Samuel nor Clara could read or write. But in the column marked months attended school, there it was Rose, 6 months. Marcus stared at the line for a long time. In those dry, bureaucratic words, he could almost feel their lives, the struggle, the exhaustion, the small victories. Samuel likely worked long days in the tobacco fields. Clara washed and ironed clothes for white families, her hands raw and swollen from soap and heat. And yet, somehow on one summer afternoon in 1910, that family had found enough money-time love to buy their little girl an ice cream cone, a small act of sweetness in a bitter world. A moment of joy they may never have known would one day be frozen forever in sepia tones, a child's smile standing quietly against the weight of history. Marcus closed his laptop and sat in silence. Outside his window, the night stretched endlessly soft and dark. He couldn't help but wonder what had become of Rose. Did she grow up here, marry, move away? Did she live to see the world change? Or had her story, like so many others, faded quietly into the silence of forgotten records? He didn't know yet, but he intended to find out. The 1920 census told a quiet but heartbreaking story. The Williams family still lived in Farmville. Yet something had changed. Samuel the father was gone. His death unrecorded, lost somewhere between the lines of the decade. Clara, now 42, worked as a cook, most likely in a white household, her hands bearing the weight of long days and endless labor. And Rose? Her name caught Marcus's eye like a spark in the dark. 18 years old, occupation school teacher. For a moment, he simply stared. A black woman teaching in early 20th century Virginia, that was nothing short of extraordinary. How had she managed it? Who had helped her when so many doors were locked tight? And what dreams had driven her even as the world tried to keep her small? The 1930 census revealed more. Rose was now married to a man named William, living in Richmond. 2 children, Robert and Margaret. A teacher still at a colored school. They even owned their home. A raw line of triumph written quietly in the ink of survival. The next morning, Marcus found himself at the Virginia Historical Society, its marble halls echoing with the ghosts of the past. He requested records from Richmond's segregated schools, personnel files, attendance logs, letters typed on fading paper. An archivist named David with wire-rimmed glasses and the gentle air of someone who lived among history brought out 3 worn boxes. These, he said softly, are from the old Moore Street School, one of the largest colored schools before integration. Most of the records were destroyed, but these survived. Marcus sifted through the fragile documents, his fingers brushing the edges of forgotten lives. Teachers who had taught against all odds classrooms filled with hope and exhaustion. Then at the bottom of the second box, he found it, a personnel file. Rose Williams, hired in 1928 to teach 3rd grade. Salary $450 a year, less than half that of her white counterparts. Her photograph was clipped to the file. A young woman with steady eyes, her hair pulled back neatly, a small brooch at her throat. She looked straight into the camera, her expression quiet but unyielding, as if she knew her strength would be tested. Marcus placed the photograph of the 8-year-old girl on his laptop beside the teacher's portrait. 18 years apart, and yet unmistakable. The same eyes, the same resolve. The little girl from Farmville, once holding an ice cream cone on a summer day, had become an educator, shaping young minds in a world that tried to deny her voice. But then Marcus saw it. A letter dated April 3rd, 1950. Its tone was formal, cold, merciless. Her teaching contract, it read, would not be renewed for the coming year due to activities incompatible with the proper conduct and responsibilities of a Negro educator. No details, no defense. Just that chilling phrase. Marcus knew exactly what it meant. It was the kind of language used to silence those who dared to stand up, those who whispered of equality, who organized, who dreamed too loudly. And so, as the daylight dimmed over Richmond, he packed his notes and drove toward Virginia Commonwealth University, to the archives where the NAACP records slept, waiting for someone to wake their truth once more. The special collections room at Virginia Commonwealth University was hushed, the air faintly scented with paper and time. The librarian, a young woman named Sandra, guided Marcus through the labyrinth of finding aids. We have meeting minutes, correspondence membership lists, records of campaigns and legal actions from the 1930s through the 1960s, she said, her voice gentle but purposeful. If Rose Williams was involved in civil rights work, her name might just be waiting in here. Marcus spent the rest of the day buried in those boxes, each one a small tomb of memory. The NAACP records told a story of fierce determination of a community that refused to remain silent. Every typed letter, every smudged signature whispered of people who had dared to fight back with courage, with faith, and with education. Then, in a box marked Meeting Minutes 1947-1950, Marcus found her, Rose Williams. Her name appeared again and again. Attendance records, committee notes, small but steady traces of presence. She had joined in 1947 and soon became part of the Education Committee, documenting the grim inequalities between white and black schools in Richmond. Collapsing buildings, missing textbooks, no heat, no plumbing. In March of 1949, her signature appeared beneath a petition signed by 73 teachers and parents, demanding equal funding as the law itself had promised but never delivered. The school board's minutes recorded the petition as received and filed, which everyone knew meant ignored. But Rose didn't stop. That November, she stood outside the school board building holding a sign that read, "Equal education for all children." A photograph from the Richmond Times-Dispatch captured the moment a dozen black teachers, their faces resolute. The article beneath the photo dismissed them as agitators. 3 months later, Rose was dismissed from her job. Marcus sat in the dim archive, light anger and admiration warring quietly inside him. She had risked everything, her career, her family's safety, simply to demand fairness. The little girl once standing outside Dalton's ice cream shop had grown into a woman brave enough to stand against an entire system. Through the records, Marcus found mentions of Rose's children, Robert and Margaret. Robert had passed away in 1998, but Margaret was still alive in Washington, D.C. His heart quickened as he traced the trail through public directories until finally a phone number. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed. On the third ring, a clear, steady voice answered. "This is Margaret." Marcus spoke carefully, explaining who he was, a researcher from the Library of Congress studying early 20th century photographs. "There's a photograph from 1910, he said softly, taken in Farmville, Virginia. It shows a young black girl eating ice cream outside a segregated shop. I believe that girl was your mother, Rose Williams." Silence. Only the faint sound of breathing on the other end, and then a voice thick with emotion. "You found a photograph of my mother as a child." "Yes, Mom. She's standing outside Dalton's sweet shop. Behind her, there's a sign that says, 'Whites Only.'" Margaret drew in a sharp breath. "I know that photograph, Dr. Webb. My mother kept it all her life. When she passed in 1989, I found it among her papers in a small box with her teaching certificates and letters from her students." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Did she ever tell you about that day?" Yes, Margaret whispered. She said it was her 8th birthday, July 14th, 1910. My grandfather saved for weeks to buy her that ice cream. He wanted her to have the best in town, even though the shop didn't serve our people. He went to the back door, waited 20 minutes and paid extra. Then he brought it out to her on the sidewalk. Margaret's voice trembled. She said it was the most delicious thing she ever tasted, and the saddest. Because through that window, she saw white children sitting at clean tables, laughing, being served with smiles while she stood outside in the heat. That day, she said she understood the world as it truly was. And that photograph, it made her both proud and angry for the rest of her life. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the great marble hall of the Library of Congress, surrounded by the murmuring crowd at the opening of a new exhibition, hidden in plain sight photographs that changed America. At its center hung the image of young Rose Williams, enlarged to nearly 4 feet wide, her small hand clutching the melting ice cream cone, her eyes glancing off the camera. Visitors stood quietly before it, reading the caption. And in that stillness, Marcus felt what history so often hides. Not statistics, not records, but a single human story. Once lost, now found. The words whites. Only. No exceptions loomed behind a harsh and undeniable frozen forever in black and white. The sign stood like a shadow against the child's innocent smile, a cruel contrast between joy and injustice. Beside it hung the portrait of Rose Williams. As a young teacher in 1928, her gaze steady, her expression calm but unyielding. Around her image, the exhibition unfolded like a life remembered in whispers. The petition she had signed in 1949, the newspaper photograph of her standing in protest, the gentle curve of her handwriting on old school reports. Each artifact traced the path from that sunny Farmville sidewalk in 1910, where an 8-year-old girl stood outside a shop that would not welcome her to the classrooms of Richmond, where she taught for 2 decades, to the moment she dared to speak for justice and lost everything for it. The story panels told it all, how Rose's courage had rippled outward, becoming part of the wider movement that would one day bring segregation to its knees. Some of her former students, now elders themselves, had written letters recalling how Miss Williams taught them not only to read, but to believe in their own worth. Many of Rose's belongings had come from Margaret's careful hands: her mother's teaching certificates, her NAACP card, the folded letters from former pupils, and that small weathered photograph she had cherished for 79 years. Marcus had also added a tribute to Thomas Whitfield, the quiet white photographer who had captured that moment without knowing how far it would travel. His long-lost negatives, images of waiting, of exclusion, of quiet dignity, were now preserved within the library's permanent archive, a testament to truth told through silence. As Marcus moved through the gallery, he watched people stop before Rose's photograph, their faces softened by the weight of history. Parents knelt beside their children, whispering explanations of what that cruel sign meant. Teenagers stared, trying to imagine what it felt like to stand on that hot sidewalk with a melting ice cream and a world divided by color. Black visitors lingered longest. Some wept quietly. One elderly woman stood motionless for almost 10 minutes, her hand pressed to her chest, before she finally turned away, tears glistening in her eyes. Beside Marcus stood Margaret, 82. Now her back still straight, her presence dignified. She looked up at the photograph of her mother and smiled through the ache in her voice. My mother would have loved this, she said softly. Not for herself, not for fame, but because she believed that truth, even painful truth, has its own kind of grace. That photograph, she whispered, shows the truth about America. The lights in the hall were dim, the air still. And as Marcus listened, surrounded by the quiet hum of memory, he thought of that small girl in 1910. A simple moment of sweetness on a divided street, and how sometimes one photograph is enough to keep history awake.